So welcome to the next section on Queenless Middlegames. Before we start out with the game, I just wanted to briefly note that I think Queenless Middlegames are often associated with a misconception, which is that because the queens have been exchanged off, attacking chances for either side have been greatly reduced since the queen is such a fundamental attacking piece. And so, as we'll see here, although it's of course nice to have the queen on the board if you're intending to conduct an attack, it's by no means obligatory. And more important factors will come into play, which will figure into whether an attack is possible and has a chance of success or not. So anyway, we'll look at this game here between two very strong grandmasters, Murray Chandler playing white and Michael Adams playing black, and this was from the Hastings tournament in 1989. So after e4, d5, e takes c5, knight f6, c4, we previously looked at the Icelandic gambit with e6, but there's another strong gambit that black can offer here, which is what Adams played in the game, with the move c6. And generally, these days, it's pretty well accepted that taking the gambit pawn involves a substantial amount of risk for white. And the reason why is because after the game continuation where Chandler did take the gambit pawn, we see that d4 is no longer possible because the knight and the queen are clamping down on that square. And furthermore, black is ahead in development and he's ready to play a move like e5. So it's pretty well accepted here that black has substantial compensation for the pawn. Nonetheless, this was tried for white quite a bit. So let's see how exactly black utilizes the compensation he has. So after knight to f3, goes e5, just threatening e4. And now white goes d3. And black goes e4 in any case, just forcing the issue. White has nothing better than to take the pawn on e4. And now after the following trading sequence, we get one of the main positions from this line. So black is down a pawn, but he has a very strong centralized knight. He's already threatening to take the pawn on f2 with the fork of the king and the rook. And also, white's king is no longer able to castle, and black has these open files on the d file and the e file with which to attack the white king. So black has substantial compensation here. So in this game, Chandler decided to play bishop to e3 just to defend against the threat of knight takes f2. Black played bishop to f5, not only activating the bishop with a potential discovered attack later on, but freeing this rook on a8 to come into the game either with rook to d8 check or with castles on the queen side. Chandler played knight to h4 to attack the bishop, but Adams took advantage of the fact that he can castle on the queen side with check, not as to waste any time. The king went over to c1, and now the bishop on f5 is attacked. And now black has a couple of interesting ideas. In the game, he played the move bishop to e6, but the impossible looking move bishop to g4 is an interesting alternative. And the idea here is that I'm threatening to go rook to d1, which will start a mating net of some kind and be a very strong attack on the white king. Of course, at first it looks like this is just out of the question because of the move f3, but black has the very strong move bishop to e7, and now we have a couple of lines. If white takes the bishop, then I go bishop takes knight here on h4, g3, and bishop to f6, and I have continued compensation here thanks to my development lead and pressure on the white position. And instead of this, if after bishop to e7, white protects the knight with pawn to g3, then I take the knight on h4 with the idea of taking the pawn on f3 on the next move. So the rook's attack there on h1, and also I'm threatening to come in with rook to d1 check, so bishop to h3 is played, not as to waste any time. King to b8, and now the rook protects d1. Rook to f1 just to attack the bishop, and now I can come back with the move bishop to h5, just getting my bishop out of the attack and protecting f7. And black is clearly better here thanks to the fact that he has no weaknesses. He has better development, a safer king, and more active pieces. So in the game, after king to c1, Adams continued with the move bishop to e6, which looks quite logical just to put some pressure on the pawn on c4. And now Chandler played a move that positionally he wouldn't really like to play, but from the standpoint of getting developed, he really had no other option, which is knight to c3. Of course, Adams took here. So now the extra pawn that white has over here, this 3 against 2, is doubled, and his king is weaker as well. Adams played the strong positional move b6. So this just fixes these pawns so that now white can't play a move like c5, for example, without it getting captured. Played knight to f3 just to try to give his knight some prospects here. And now I think Adams missed a strong finesse, which would have been bishop to a3 check. And the idea here is that driving the king to the b file actually benefits black later on when he plays the move bishop to c5, and we'll see why. So for example, king to c2, bishop to f5 check, king to b3, so the bishop on a3 is attacked, bishop to c5. So we've seen that we've driven the king to the b file, but now the point is that if you take on c5, after b takes c5, I have a ready avenue here to try to initiate some type of mating net, in particular because I'm shutting off the escape square on c2 with my bishop. So after bishop to e2 for white, king to c7, king to a3, just getting out of the attack, rook h to e8, rook h to e1, rook e6, intending an eventual rook a6, bishop to f1, rook e to d6. Of course, black doesn't want to trade, and he also wants to prevent the rook on a1 from getting into the game on d1. King to b2, just trying to get out of a potential danger zone. Now the move f6 would be very strong, just cutting out any ideas of knight to e5. And black has very, very good compensation here, given the limited mobility of the white pieces. The other idea would be that after bishop to a3 check, king to c2, all these moves that we saw before, instead of bishop to f1, white could have tried to play rook a to d1 just to try to exchange off immediately. Of course, black is not going to oblige. Goes rook to b8, rook to d5, just trying to get active with the double threat to the bishop on f5 and the pawn on c5. Now black has an amazing move, knight to d4, just uncovering the rook on e6 and intending rook to c6 checkmate, rook to a6 checkmate. White goes rook takes c5, king to d8, so still threatening rook to a6 mate. Here, here, bishop to d1, so finally dealing with the threat that I mentioned, but now the tactics favor black. So knight takes f3, and if white were to take on e6, black would just calmly recapture with the bishop, and he's going to win material. So the other option after knight takes f3 is to play bishop takes f3, but of course this loses material as well after rook takes e1, rook takes f5, and even though white has 2 pawns for the exchange, he's going to lose one of them very quickly, and his king is still in a precarious position after rook to c1. So this would be a clearly better position for black. So going back to the game, after knight f3, Adams didn't see that finesse or didn't play that finesse. He just played the move bishop to c5 immediately. Chandler took. Rook to b1, rook h8. So all of the black pieces have been developed. And now was a really critical moment for white. He has to reckon with the challenge of trying to get developed, despite the fact that black is fully developed. And so in the game, he played the very natural move bishop to e2, which was a mistake. Instead, he should have tried to play even more actively with the move rook to b5, just intending to play rook takes c5, bishop to g4. Black really needs to fight fire with fire. There's no other option. Rook takes c5, and then bishop takes f3, g takes f3, rook to e1 check, king to c2, and king to b7. So very unclear position here. White's structure is totally ruined, but he is up 2 pawns. Alternatively, after bishop to c4, instead of taking the pawn on c5, white could have tried to play safety move here first with king to c2, bishop to f5 here, and then bishop to e4. But now it's the same deal as before from the standpoint of I'm going to be able to play rook to b8 and try to get a mating net here. So after bishop to e2, black has an even stronger tactical shot than rook to b8. He goes bishop to c2 check, which compels the king to take. We gain the material back, king to b1 check here, and then black can either take on a2 or take on f2 when he's doing very well in either case. So back to the game. After rook h to e8, Chandler played the move bishop to e2, which looks natural enough. But the issue is that Adams had a very strong tactical shot. So the first point is that it might look like bishop to f5 works with the idea of rook takes e2 and bishop takes b1, but white could get out of this with rook to b2. So instead, after bishop to e2, Adams found the very strong shot bishop to h3, and the point here is that g2 is attacked as well as the bishop on e2, and if you take the bishop as played in the game, black's rook is activated on the second rank and white's pawn structure is weakened even further. The alternative after bishop to h3 was to go rook to e1. This is probably the best move, just to give back the pawn. Bishop takes g2, knight to h4, just attacking the bishop, bishop to e4, attacking the rook on b1, rook to b5, attacking the pawn on c5, and now bishop to d3, just utilizing the pin on the e-file, bishop to g4, king to c7, and very unclear position, but this was pretty much the best that white could have hoped for from this continuation. Because after bishop to h3, g takes f3, rook takes e2, yes, it's true that Adams is down a pawn, but he has tremendous compensation. White's pawn structure is totally ruined. Black has better activity, better development, and better coordination. So white sought here to exchange off his passive rook for black's active rook with the move rook to b2. Black took. And now rook to d3. So the point of attacking the knight is that the knight is defending the square on d2, so after it moves, black will be able to go rook to d2 and fort the king and the pawn and get back his pawn, which is exactly what happened. Knight to g5, rook d2 check, king a3, rook takes f2. And now the following endgame is not particularly relevant for the concepts we're going over, but it's worth going over yourself to see how Adams converted this equal material endgame where white has more weaknesses than he does. So the next game features two grandmasters, Nick DeFermian playing the white pieces and Granda Zuniga again with the black pieces. So the game started out as a Scandinavian defense, e4, d5. White took on d5, and unlike the previous games we saw with knight f6, here Granda recaptured with the queen. And now the most natural move, knight c3, also happens to be the main line. In this game, DeFermian played d4, which actually has somewhat of a dubious reputation because of black's strong counter here, pawn to e5, just blasting open the center and putting more pressure on the d4 pawn immediately. And here, the game continuation, DeFermian took on e5, and he got into a lot of trouble here after black took the queen here on c1, white recaptures, and even though white's a pawn up here, his king is displaced, and the pawn on e5 will be quite difficult to protect without spending additional time. So we'll see how that played out. But just going back here, after e5, some better alternatives for white would have been knight to c3, queen takes d4, e takes d4, and now knight to b5. So thanks to the fork here on d4 and c7, black has to protect c7, so white is going to take back on d4 and be material even after knight a6, knight f6, and then knight g to f3 would be one way to play. So that would be possible. Just going back after e5, the move knight to f3 is also possible, but this really shouldn't promise white an advantage should black play accurately. Anyway, going back to the game here, after e5, d takes e5, queen takes d1, king takes d1, knight c6. White already has a problem with the e5 pawn, so he decided to play the move f4 to defend this. Had he played knight f3, which looks more natural, now after the move bishop to g4, black has a number of ideas here. First of all, of course, thanks to the pin, he's threatening to take back the pawn on e5, but then on top of that, he's also threatening to castle on the queen side and catch the white king out here on d1 immediately. So in the game, after knight to c6, f4 was preferred, but of course, this spends more time on pawn moves when white would like to focus on developing his pieces. And now we have a choice here for black. In the game, he decided to play bishop f5, which looks very natural, just setting up to castle on the queen side again, and also targeting the c2 pawn. I think a good alternative would have been the move f6. So just like with the other games on the DVD, the general principle here of opening up the central files when your opponent's king is stuck in the middle like this makes a lot of sense, and he's also seeking to accelerate his development. For example, if white takes this pawn, now after black takes back, he's developed another piece for free and opened up the e-file, and we'll have the same idea as before. So to play bishop to g4 check or bishop to f5 and then castles on the queen side. So I think e takes f6 would be a clear mistake there, playing into black's hands. Instead, white should try to get developed with knight to f3, bishop to g4, just as before, bishop to e2, breaking the pin, castles on the queen side check, bishop d2, and now black could play f takes e5, knight takes e5, so white would like to trade off some pieces. And now I think a good move is bishop to e6, so not giving white the opportunity to exchange off more pieces and also get his king on a safer location there on e2. And now this pawn on e5 is isolated and is going to be quite weak, and black could play some plan like this to try to recapture it. And so white has a very uncomfortable position here. And despite his pawn advantage, as we see, this isn't going to count for much, given that black will most likely recapture the pawn shortly or obtain a strong initiative in any case. After bishop to d2 here, it was also possible for black to go bishop to c5. That looks perfectly good, just threatening to go bishop to e3 for one thing, and seeking to continue to develop with, say, knight to e7 and knight to d5. So anyway, back to the game. After f4, bishop to f5, de Fermian played the move c3, which once again is playing another pawn move when he would really like to develop his pieces. So, and I think from a concrete standpoint, this move ends up being dubious as well, and we'll see how that played out. He probably should have just tried to develop his pieces here with knight to f3, castles on the queen side, bishop to d2, and now black has the very strong move f6, as discussed before. So after c3, well, the idea here was to take away the d4 and b4 squares from the knight in particular, and then also try to give his king a square on c2. I know that it's guarded by the bishop now, but he would like to have that square, he'd like to be able to use that escape square and somehow secure it so that the king can run away there at some point. But, it must be said that he's falling further behind in development, and castles on the queen side is quite a natural move here, and white now has to lose additional time dealing with the check.
he moved the king to e1. I think he did this instead of moving, say, the bishop to d2 or the knight to d2, because he would still be very, very gummed up there as far as his development's concerned, and it would be very difficult to get coordinated and try to get his pieces out. But after king to e1, Granda played an excellent move, the aforementioned f6. So just trying to blast open the position even further and accelerate his development even further. And this is oftentimes what happens when you have a development advantage and you continue to strike while the iron is hot, so to speak, is that you build up a kind of momentum where your advance or your lead in development builds upon itself. So it's a situation where once you get that going, your opponent will never really be able to catch up. So de Fermian tried to exchange off here with bishop to b5, thinking that after black takes in the center, he could throw in this in-between move. Bishop takes knight, b takes c6, and then f takes e5. So hoping that by exchanging off a pair of minor pieces, that will somehow lessen the initiative. There's a couple of problems with this, though. The first problem, as we've talked about before, is that this unopposed bishop now is going to be an extremely strong piece, particularly given that white's light squares were already weakened by moves like c3, so he has this hole on d3. And then secondly, the black pawn structure over here, even though it's weakened optically, there's nothing that white can really do to exploit this. So that's really a non-factor. Finally, the king still is going to be stuck in the middle here, and it's going to take a long time to try to get it to safety, because this bishop pair here for black in this open position is extremely strong and will control a lot of important squares. So bishop to c5 was played, both preventing white from developing with bishop to e3 and also taking away this potential escape square on f2. Alternatively, Granda could have also tried to go rook to e8 and just target the pawn on e5 immediately, knight f3, and then the very strong move knight to f6, just setting up for ideas like knight to g4 or knight to d7 to further target the e5 pawn. So that was totally playable as well. So after f takes e5, bishop to c5, bishop to c5, white played knight to f3. And now we see the star move of the game, which is the move you would like to play from a principle standpoint, but of course it looks impossible at first glance. And that move is knight to f6. Well, we'd like to play it, of course, because it's the most active square to develop the knight to. And at first it looks like white can just take it and there's no problem. But the point is that every single black piece is going to be in on the attack now, and the center is totally blown open, and the white king is going to get stuck into a mating net here after rook h to e8. And so white only has he has a few ways to block the check. They lose material. If he decides to move the king, then bishop to d3 is made. So knight f6 puts white in a really, really difficult situation already. He tried to play bishop to g5, seeing that the knight was immune to capture, and just figured that maybe he could hope to exchange off some more pieces and somehow get out of this. h6 was played. And of course, taking the knight on f6 doesn't solve his problems either, because we know that as soon as that e-file gets open, rook h to e8 happens, and it's the same outcome as before. So after h6, he retreated with bishop to h4, g5, just continuing with the initiative, and now bishop to f2. So this looks like it was the idea all along, to reroute this bishop back to f2 and hopefully exchange off another attacker. But black's initiative is at such an advanced stage that he can actually afford to exchange off and keep the attack going. Normally, when you're attacking, we know that you should avoid exchanges, but there are some exceptions to that rule. And also, when you avoid exchanges, a lot of the time you will lose time as a result of that. And so it's more important, in order to keep the initiative going, not to lose time and to exchange off instead. So that's kind of a judgment call, and it really depends on the concrete features of the position. Here, Granda saw that after he took and played knight to g4 check, not only hasn't he lost any time, but he's going to be gaining time thanks to the check on the king, and that he had more than sufficient piece reserves to keep the attack going, so that after king to g3, the move h5 was extremely strong. So just threatening to go h4 check, and if the king moves to h3, then knight to f2 is mate. So de Fermian tried to get some squares over here, some additional escape squares, as well as break up the pawn duo over here on g5 and h5 with the move h4. Granda took. And so the point here too is now the g file is open, so that's another avenue of attack for black. Knight takes h4 was played, and now bishop to h7 was the game move. I think rook to d3 would be even stronger and more in line with some of the attacking concepts that I mentioned a second ago, where we don't want to retreat and lose time. And so black forces the action here. So white can either block or move the king. If he plays king f4, attacking the bishop, then the bishop simply goes back to e6. So he's blockading the pawn on e5, and he's ready to bring his rook to f8 here and continue the attack. If after rook to d3, he goes knight to f3 instead, now rook to g8, just setting up a discovered attack here with the knight on the king. Discovered check there. For example, white could try to get out of this either with some tactics or just moving the king. If he just moved the king over here to f4, now after knight e3, he's actually caught in a very unpleasant mating net idea with rook to g4, and so you'd have a lot of problems there. And then not to mention, at some point, black could throw a knight to c2 once he gets a chance. Additionally, if after rook to g8, white tried to get out of this with tactics himself, with the move rook takes h5, thinking that he can meet any knight move with blocking with the rook on g5, that actually is not going to work out too well, because after knight f6 check, rook to g5, there's the move knight to e4, which wins the material. So going back to the game, after knight takes h4, Granda retreated with bishop to h7. Knight f3 was played just to anticipate the rook to d3 check idea, so that in this case it's not check, and also he's hitting the pawn on h5 now. Black played rook h to g8. Rook takes h5, and it was the same idea that we just saw. Knight f6 check here, and knight e4. g5, and now an excellent move from Granda, which really exposes white's development lag, his lack of coordination, and his weak king. And that move was rook to d1. Excellent move. So targeting the knight on b1 with the rook and the bishop, and then also threatening to come around here to h1 at some point. So for example, if white played the move knight takes h7, then rook to h1 is mate. And well, what else is there to do? The knight's pinned on b1, so the rook on a1 is going to be lost if the knight moves. So de Fermian tried the move e6, just trying to mix things up somehow. Rook to g1 was played. Just threatening to take on g2, and then either rook h2 would be made if that knight on g5 moved, and it's forcing the action because there would be a double attack on that knight from these rooks. Knight to d2 was played. Took the rook. Still can't take the bishop on h7 because of the mate. So knight df3. Bishop to e4. Still can't move that knight because of the mate, and so black's just going to exchange off the pieces and consolidate very easily here. So white tried to avoid that. But now c5. And after knight to b3, rook to g1, he had seen enough with a huge material disadvantage and also continuing to get attacked from the black pieces.